Korean Punchbowl battles. Filipino soldiers fight brutal mountain combat. A remote valley in Korea, ringed by steep mountains. Inside that bowl of earth, soldiers climb toward machine gun fire. Among them are Filipinos who have crossed the Pacific to fight in a war not their own. Within hours, these mountains will turn into a trap. But what happens on these ridgelines will decide whether the United Nations line in Korea holds. Late summer, August 1951, the Heian Basin in eastern Korea. American maps called it the Punchbowl. From the air, it resembled a vast crater carved into the mountain's steep ridges, forming a 5-mile-wide circle around a low valley. Whoever held the heights could see everything below. For soldiers on the ground, the terrain meant something similar. No cover, no easy approach, and nowhere to hide. The front lines had stabilized across the peninsula, but armistice negotiations were faltering. Commanders ordered a limited offensive to seize the high ground. Among the troops moving into the mountains were soldiers from the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea known as PEFTOC. By 1951, more than 7,000 Filipino troops had deployed to Korea, serving alongside American, British, Turkish, and South Korean forces. Many were World War II veterans. Others were barely in their 20s. Most had never seen mountains like this. The terrain around the Punchbowl rose sharply into narrow ridges that could only be approached on foot. Supply trucks could go no farther than the valley. Ammunition, water, and radios had to be carried upward by hand. Each step upward made the soldiers visible. And the defenders were waiting. North Korean troops had spent months preparing the high ground. Their trenches followed the reverse slopes, hidden from artillery. Machine gun nests were dug into solid rock. Mortar were pre-registered onto every possible approach. The assaults began before dawn. Thousands of United Nations artillery shells slammed into the hillsides. The blasts rolled through the mountains, bouncing from ridge to ridge. Then the infantry began moving. Filipino troops climbed with rifles slung forward and steel helmets pulled low. The slopes were so steep that soldiers sometimes had to climb on their hands and knees. Above them, the ridgeline remained completely silent. But that silence rarely lasted long. A burst of machine gun fire suddenly raked the hillside. Men dropped flat against the ground. Others crawled forward, searching for shallow folds in the earth to hide from the next burst. Mortar shells followed, the explosions walking slowly down the slope, probing the climbing lines. If the assault stalled halfway up the hill, the attackers would remain exposed to fire from every direction. So the climb continued. A few yards at a time, hours passed. By midday, the first units were within a few hundred meters of the crest. This was where the battle always changed. The last stretch to the ridgeline could not be approached slowly. It had to be taken all at once. Late afternoon, September 1951, the assault elements of the UN forces were closing within the last 200 meters of the crest. The Filipino troops had already climbed through belts of rifle and mortar fire. But the heaviest resistance always came near the top. Private First Class Antonio Reyes, a rifleman in a Philippine battalion combat team, felt the terrain flatten slightly beneath his boots. The crest was close. He checked the distance to the next rock outcrop and began crawling. The soil was loose. Each movement sent small stones sliding down the slope. A burst of automatic fire tore across the hillside. The North Korean defenders had waited until the attackers reached open ground just below the ridge. Mortar rounds began falling seconds later. The explosions were sharp and violent. Dirt and rock fragments struck helmets like hail. Down in the basin, American artillery observers tracked the ridge. Within minutes, shells began landing along the crestline. The ridge disappeared in smoke. For a brief moment, the enemy machine gun fell silent. That was the signal. Move! Filipino and American soldiers rose from the ground and began the last uphill rush. The distance was short, less than 100 meters, but the slope offered almost no cover. Rifles fired as the men ran. Grenades were pulled free and thrown toward the crest. Halfway up, the machine gun opened up again, firing directly into the charging line. 2 soldiers fell. Another dropped behind a rock, returning fire. Private Reyes reached the crest seconds later. A narrow trench appeared suddenly in front of him, reinforced with logs and sandbags. A North Korean soldier rose inside the trench with a rifle. The distance between them was less than 5 meters. Reyes fired once. The man dropped back. Behind him, more Filipino soldiers breached the crest. They moved along the trench with rifles and grenades, clearing positions one by one. The fighting became close, brutal, and brief. The ridge was taken. But as darkness began to settle over the mountains, the men realized something chilling. The fighting for the Punchbowl was not a single battle. It was a chain of assaults. And the defenders were already moving through the darkness below. Darkness came quickly. The captured ridge was narrow and uneven. Private Reyes and the other Filipino soldiers worked in silence, turning the captured enemy positions outward to face the slope they had just climbed. Sandbags were dragged into place. Ammunition was passed from man to man. The boxes were nearly empty, and resupply meant a dangerous trek up the exposed mountain. Still, the ridge had to be held. Losing it meant climbing the mountain all over again. The first mortar round landed shortly after midnight, flashing white against the darkness. A second followed. Dirt fell from the trench walls as the impacts crept closer. Movement was spotted on the lower slope. Flares were fired into the sky. For a moment, the mountainside lit up like daylight. Dozens of figures were moving upward through the brush. The counterattack had begun. Rifles opened along the trench line. Reyes fired carefully into the darkness, aiming at the shapes advancing between rocks. The enemy soldiers moved quickly, spreading out to avoid bunching under fire. The distance shrank. 30 meters, 20. Grenades began landing along the ridge. One rolled into the trench near Reyes. He kicked it back over the parapet just before it exploded. Moments later, the first attackers reached the edge of the position. The fighting descended into terrifying close-quarters combat. Rifles fired at point-blank range. Bayonets and entrenching tools were used in the narrow trenches. For several minutes, the Filipino line bent, but it did not break. Then, the artillery arrived. Forward observers had called in coordinates. Seconds later, UN artillery shells struck the slope just below the trench. The explosions rolled upward through the darkness, breaking the counterattack. The enemy withdrew slowly down the hillside. By the time the guns stopped firing, the mountain had grown quiet again. Reyes leaned against the trench wall, checking his bandolier. Not many rounds left, but the ridge was still theirs. Dawn slowly revealed the valley. Mist hung low over the Punchbowl. From the ridge, the soldiers could see the true scale of the battlefield. The coming days would bring more assaults, more artillery, and more casualties. But gradually, UN forces pushed forward, securing the key heights around the basin. Today, the Punchbowl Valley remains quiet. Forests have returned to the slopes where trenches once cut through the earth. But the mountains remember. And so do the nations whose soldiers climbed them. If you value the stories of soldiers whose sacrifices shaped history, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment below, honoring the soldiers who fought there, and let us know where you're watching from. Their struggle in places like the Punchbowl ensured their sacrifice would not disappear into silence. History survives when it is remembered. Thank you so much for subscribing, liking, and commenting on our video. God bless and stay safe always.